Good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Schlund, and I'll be going through parts classification today. So here is the agenda. We're going to cover three key points: why you want to classify, determining the ROI. I'm going to go through that real quick. I know a lot of you guys just watched the movie, right? So you can slow the movie down and read the PowerPoint if you want, but I'll just quickly kind of go over that because that's not really the intent of this presentation. And then we'll do some tips and best practices with maximizing design reuse. And then finally, I'll do a quick demonstration to show you how this software works. And the software I'm referring to is PartsLink. So with that, let's get on to our discussion today. So this is my 2003 Mazda Tribute. So I've had it since it was a baby. Had it a long time, been a really good vehicle for me, but it's old, right? And as time goes, it starts to wear. And what happened in the front on the grill is one of the bolts broke. And so the grill was real loose. So I said, all right, so I'll go and fix this myself. It's just a bolt. So I have a bunch of screws and bolts in the garage in different buckets. And I was smart enough to separate the screws from the bolts, but not the different size bolts. So there's lots of them. And I looked through them. I couldn't really find one that would fit. That would be the right size. Some were too long, some were bigger diameter, all those types of things. So I ended up running over to the local, and I actually went to Menards, not to Home Depot or Lowe's, but I went and got some bolts, a bolt that I needed that would fit in fixing my grill. The thing is when I bought it, it was packaged in groups of 4. I only needed one, but it's like, okay, it's only a couple of bucks, so I'll just buy this group of bolts. And I'll grab one of them and take the other 3, not really use those, and take that bolt, fix the grill on the Mazda, and then the other 3 I throw back in my bucket of bolts, probably to never be seen again. The thing is that I never really found value in emptying out my bolt bucket and categorizing them and maybe separating them out into separate jars or something like that. But it would have helped me in this particular case. It's kind of a simple example, but we're going to talk about this on a much larger scale than a Mazda Tribute. The thing is that we want to improve your ability to find things. And if you're easily able to find things, it's much more likely that you will reuse those. Reusing things is going to save money. So I kind of look at this in 3 different categories of value, each one kind of progressing more and more from the previous. So the first one is, you'll notice that there's a WT part symbol in the middle here, the little gear part. So I'm talking about PartsLink. PartsLink requires you to be using WT parts. So the nice thing about a WT part is I can hang in a CAD model, some drawings, data sheets, maybe some test results, approved manufacturer lists, all types of information I can hang off of this WT part. And then it's in Windchill and I can find it. Right? I can do a search, I can find it. That has value. Now the thing is, once you start doing parts classification, then we increase the value because what we're going to be able to do is distinguish between similar parts. So for instance, I can apply to a part, I could say, this is a 1-inch diameter. I can give it material, weight, cost, a variety of different things. And this will allow me to distinguish this part from any other part that I might have in Windchill. So that's more value, right? Because then we can start weeding out duplicate parts and things like that. And then finally, the most value of all is when we start doing a fully defined bill of material, because now we have our components fully defined. Instead of it saying bracket or bolt, it's going to say 1/4-inch steel bolt or something like that. What this will also allow you to do, PartsLink, and it just started that with Windchill 11, is that it can do auto naming. So what you can do is take some of the different attributes that you have in a classification, like thread length or material or cost or something like that, and use that to kind of make a name for the part. It's still going to have a part number, but this name can be auto-created. So it gives it a better definition if you look at it in a bill of material as to exactly what that particular component is. So it's really at the foundation of PLM to be able to classify parts and to be able to access and reuse those easily. So I want to talk a little bit about the engineering world, right, which is the one that I work in a lot. And When I look at components, if I have a CAD model, that's great, right? Because that's what I want to need to put in my assembly. And I might have some information that's useful to me, maybe like life cycle states or things like that. But basically the CAD model and maybe the drawing and some things that are important to me in the engineering world. But we want to also be able to easily give that access and kind of rich data to people outside of the engineering world. So when we start to include things like weight and cost, even like the classification could be thought of maybe as a commodity code that can help people in procurement, in quality, supply chain. So now the other people, the other groups in our enterprise can get this useful information from Windchill, whereas previously it might not have been so easily available to them. So here's the ROI part. I'm going to go through this real quickly. This is at a high level to try to determine an ROI. Why would you want to get PartsLink? First is you can look at the parts in Windchill. Don't look at all of them. You know, you've been pumping parts in there for years and years, but look at maybe the active parts, maybe the parts that were made in the last year or something like that. Those are what you want to consider kind of the subset. You can also look at part introductions. So how many parts per month do you introduce into the Windchill environment? And that can be actually kind of determined from a report probably pretty easily in Windchill. And then finally, you can look at material suppliers. So not the suppliers of paper and pencils and things like that, but suppliers that provide the material for creating these different components. So those are kind of the areas that you want to look at. And if we look a little bit more deeply into that, we can look at the engineering costs. Obviously, there's the overhead of the engineers creating the components or working with them, analyzing them, whatever that job may be. Sourcing could actually be a big cost if you have kind of a long lead item. A lot of negotiations and other things need to be done in order to get that on board in time. And also just transactional costs and logistics shipping things. And then we can look at processes that are impacted. You know, when we have new part requests, there's a process involved with that. Searching takes up time. There's cost involved with that. Supplier qualifications and sourcing. So when I start talking about supplier qualifications, part sourcing, there's actually kind of a whole other application that can work with this, and that's supplier management. We're not, again, going to be talking about that today. We're focusing on parts classification and PartsLink, but it really dovetails really well with PartsLink. And here, and finally, we can look at supplier spend. So maybe we're getting components from different suppliers. We might get different rates depending on the volume. If it's the same part, maybe we can narrow that down to a single supplier, just make things a little bit easier for us there. And again, we're not just talking about nuts and bolts like I was with my Mazda, but we could be talking about much larger, more expensive type items, you know, motors and things like that. So here is the simple mathematical equation to figure out your ROI. Like I said, it's at a real high level, but you put in the numbers and you will save millions of dollars. And that might not be necessarily the case with you, right? In some companies it will be. But what we can do at a high level is just give you a thumbnail quick idea of the amount of money that you could save potentially by using PartsLink. And that's really what it's all about. But if you wanted to get a more kind of in-depth, detailed return on investment kind of calculation, there is a spreadsheet that your friendly neighborhood EAC sales rep can sit down with you and go through and get some more definitive numbers that are stand up a little bit more to scrutiny. But again, you guys that are watching the movies, you can always stop this at any time and kind of read through this stuff. So let's go on to our third point that I wanted to highlight on, and that's maximizing design reuse. So again, we're talking about component classification, which is PartsLink, and supplier management, which we're just kind of mentioning that. But the thing we want to do is we want to define and manage classification. So we create a tree structure and we assign attributes to each node in the tree structure. And an attribute is a characteristic, right? Like length or cost or weight or something like that. This is all intricately tied with Windchill. So seamlessly, we can add this information to our WT parts. And again, when we're classifying these parts, we're assigning attributes to them, and then these attributes can be used to distinguish one part from a similar or another part. We can also have required constraints. So you can have maybe 20 or 30 constraints, but the good idea is to have required constraints. So every part that I start to classify in Windchill is going to have at least these 5 or 8 different constraints. And then again, those are the ones that are used when we're searching to distinguish parts from one another. So we can find and compare those parts doing a variety of different searches or browsing for them. And then this bottom point down here, just optimizing supplier and component selection, that has to do with the supplier management product, but that involves creating manufacturing lists and approved vendor lists, and then also kind of standardizing on suppliers and the introduction process of components. But like I said, that's probably for another day. So one of the things when we classify parts, like I mentioned before, there are different types of attributes that we can apply. We want to apply required classifications. So here's a list of classifications you can apply to your WT part, and here's a list of the attributes that you can apply to those. Again, it's also flexible. You can always, kind of create your own attributes and add those on. You really want attributes to be kind of a hard number. If they're all text attributes, it makes it much more difficult to search for things. But if it's a hard number, like the length of a bolt or the thread length or the diameter or the horsepower of a motor or things like that, that makes it a lot easier to search on and also to distinguish. And each part that we classify has a profile, so we'll be able to see the attributes that are applied to that particular profile of that component. And again, we can also group those attributes, and those are kind of grouped in terms of a layout we apply to a node. So when it comes to finding then and comparing, there's a couple different ways of doing that. We can just do a free-form search, just like we always do in Windchill. Just type in, part of a part name, part of a part number, and we can add some attributes to it and just do the regular search. There's also the ability to navigate down the tree. If you watched an earlier presentation that I might have done, or that I did do, you might have watched it, had to do with searching in Windchill. And one of the types of searches that you don't see too often is called a faceted search. But what it does is it gives you an initial listing of things that you're searching for, and then you can narrow that list down. That's really what Parts Link does, and we'll be able to see that during my presentation in a couple minutes here. And then we can refine the search down more and more. You can even find similar parts. You can right mouse button on that little I information button, and you can say find similar, and it'll find all the parts that are similar to the one that you have there. So that's all things that have to do with Parts Link. So let's take a look at working with Parts Link first of all. So I have Windchill up here. This is my home page. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go over and I'm going to say browse. And then I have Parts Link. I have this little guy right here, right? Parts Classification. So I'm going to select on that. And we can see here, this is where we manage our classifications. This is where we create what classifications we have and what attributes are assigned to those. So I'm going to say, let's select that. And it pops up kind of our classification management interface. But you can see here, as I mentioned before, it's kind of a tree structure, right? So I'm going to come down here, and we've broken the tree into mechanical and electrical. And I can expand this further. Let's look at the mechanical stuff. And we can say we've got metric fasteners. We can expand that out. So again, these are all, think of them as folders almost, but they're nodes in this tree. And we see we have washers, we have flange bolts. So I want to go and create my own node. It's going to be a subset of these flange bolts. So I'm just going to select on here, and I'm going to say, let's create a new node, kind of a sub node underneath the flange bolts. So it brings up an interface, and the internal name we want to call this is maybe like titanium bolts, and it doesn't like spaces, right? So I put an underscore in there. The display name is in the tree. We saw all the listings there. Well, what's the name that's going to show up in the tree? And I'm just going to say titanium. All right. And then, we can put in a description, and, I can do all that stuff. Here's the thing. If it's an electrical part, I could actually put in a schematic that represents that particular component. Here, I'm going to put in an image. So when we browse, we can also browse through images This would be the image that we'd see for these titanium bolts. So I'm going to say browse, and I'm looking on my desktop, and I have this little bolt JPEG that I got from Google. All right, so I'm going to use that as well. Instantiable just means can I search on it, right? So I'm going to say, okay, let's add that. So now underneath our hexagon flange bolts, we have our titanium ones, and here's our titanium. We can see that. Remember, this is the word that I typed in, so that's what we see in the model tree. Here's the little image that I used, right? So now when we start searching by images, that will be the image that will pop up for our titanium bolts. So that's really the gist of it, how we do that. One thing I haven't done is assign any attributes to that. So you'll notice I have, these are the assigned attributes. So it kind of trickles down, right? So the hexagon flange bolts have certain attributes, and if I create a subtree, they inherit those attributes. So here are those attributes. We can see we have the thread length, we have things like that. So those are the types of things. If I select on length, it pops up the information here. I can put in a default value. It has a constraint, you know, it's between this length and that length type of thing. And if you're using text strings, it's how many characters does your text string have. So those are kind of the limitations of that. But so each one of these have these different types of characteristics applied to those. But now I have a titanium flange bolt created. So I can just exit out of this and go back to my Windchill environment. So let's say I want to go in and create a part now. So I'm going to browse to a folder, and typically, you know, for a bolt, I'd probably put it in the library, but I'm just going to come over here and say, let's do it in a folder that we have here. Now remember, we need to use WT parts. So I'm going to say, let's create a part. And it will be a part. The name here, we could say is, I don't know, titanium flange bolt. And we'll say that we buy this. All right. So again, this is just different ways of separating it out. This is for service. We'll say now it's for design. But here's where we start to get in here, classification, right? This is the guy. So what classifications do we have? I could search for my titanium thing and would type it in, but we can browse through it. So these are the main headings, and then we can kind of expand these out. They all have little pluses next to them. We go over, you notice our hexagon flange bolts now have a plus next to it because we have a subset. And this is the guy that this is the classification I want to assign to it. So I'll say okay. So now he's been assigned that particular classification, and with that classification brings those attributes. So there's actually inside of Windchill, kind of techie thing, there is a classification attribute, and it basically ties all these attributes onto this WT part. So you have to make this classification attribute, which is kind of the sticky glue that holds on these other attributes we're about to look at. So when I move to the next little thing here, it says, what's the length of this? So I could say the length is maybe, I don't know, let's say 46 millimeters. And we can give it thread length, and I can give it all these other things as well, but we'll say we're finished with this now. So now we've created a titanium flange bolt that's in Windchill, and it has those attributes associated with it. Let's just do a regular classification explorer. So now that I have WT parts, I can use this. Now I mentioned before, I can search by expanding out these nodes, but what I'm going to do is go over to mechanical. I can search under there. I can search under fasteners. I can search under hex bolts. And here's our titanium with property of 1, right? We just put in one part, right? Because we just made this. But we could find him that way. Another thing I could do is let's go to our flange bolts, and we can see those all here. And this is where I could find, if I find a particular part, I can right mouse button on this, and I can say find similar parts, right? So that's a parts link type of thing, and it will give me all parts that are similar to this particular part that I see here. But one of the other things that I can do, if we go to our, let's look at our flange bolts here. And I mentioned before, we have a faceted search. this is kind of what a faceted search does. So we have a list of all our flange bolts, right? There's like 70 of them or something, 69 of those. And then now we can start to narrow down what kind of flange bolt I want. So under length, I could say, let's search anywhere between 50 and 70. And so now it's narrowed down our search, and these are just narrowing it down by length. I could also do it by thread length, so you can kind of get the idea that we're using multiple filters here for this. Now I could say between 40 and 70, and we can search that, and that will include our part, but it's here along a bunch of other parts as well. So one of the things that I can do is go under maybe classification, and now that we have this other classification under hex bolts, like I say, give me all the ones hex bolts that are titanium, and there's our one part that we put in there, right? And it's not going to give us a visualization because we don't have a CAD part tied to it. And that's the thing too, if we're managing parts in Windchill, BOM management, I might not necessarily need a CAD part for this, right? I just want it to show up in a bill of material. It might be in a service bill of material where this is part of the service kit or something like that. But anyway, this is kind of working with parts link, and you can kind of see it's really kind of a nice interface as far as narrowing down your parts. The only thing is put in the classifications, and it gives you that ability to narrow down and find similar parts and distinguish between parts. And again,